I'm interning with the sheriff's police department, so most of my time is spent on parole. We got called out to do a wellness check, which the deputy thought was going to be a piece of cake, thinking that the woman was out of town or something. We got there and were met by several neighbors who told us that the mail was piling up in the mailbox and that there were several untouched packages on the porch. We went up to the house and the front door was unsecured, so we cracked it a couple of inches and the deputy called inside. We didn't hear an answer, and the door wouldn't budge further. It was a split-level house, and we assumed there must have been stuff on the landing between the stairs. The deputy told me that the resident was a known hoarder, which would definitely explain why the door was stuck. He also mentioned that if we saw any flies on the inside of the windows, that she was most likely inside and deceased. Sure enough, as we walked around the side of the house, we saw a lot of flies clustering on the windows. The back door was locked, and we could see bags of garbage and diapers and miscellaneous shit all over the place through the window. We headed back to the front and attempted to enter. He pushed the door open, this time with more force, and from underneath I could see a grease-like liquid spreading out from under the door. The deputy stopped, closed it, and calmly told me that the lady was indeed dead and wedged behind the door. Based on the dates marked on her packages, we concluded that she had been gone for about 2 months. We finally made entry to the house and I was allowed inside. After 2 months, she didn't even look human anymore. Her skin and body had sagged and melted to the floor, and her face was all black and had been eaten to the bone by maggots. I'll never forget the smell when the coroners moved her. It was almost like a physical presence. Whatever those people get paid to deal with that shit, it's not enough. The thing that really got to me, though, was wondering if she had fallen down the stairs and died there, or if she fell and was unable to move, waiting for help that would never come. I'm a second-generation firefighter. My father spent the latter days of his career as a fire safety director at a massive mental asylum. Our state version of OSHA has to come and do inspections at all facilities regularly. His was no exception. So the OSHA inspectors came by and made their way to an abandoned part of the facility that used to house the criminally insane. The absolute worst of the worst. Serial killers, rapists, cannibals, you name it. My father left them with keys and a flashlight because the electricity didn't work. The inspectors were radioing back to my father that they kept hearing talking and footsteps, but my father knew this was impossible. It couldn't even be squatters because each section was isolated with locked doors. Eventually, the inspectors gave up and actually left without finishing. My dad decided to stick around and check the alarm boxes they didn't get to. As he was checking out one of the alarms, he felt as if someone was watching him from down the hall. When he turned to look, a shadow formed with a head, shoulders, and torso, but no legs, and just 2 holes where there should be eyes. Not wanting to even think about what he was seeing, my dad ran out of there. Since the hospital was shut down, it's been on Ghost Adventures, Ghost Hunters, and a myriad of other shows and movies. My dad's even been in some of them. Jason from Ghost Hunters called it the scariest place he's ever investigated. "911 dispatcher reporting in. I received a call from an elderly lady who had trouble breathing. I had taken several calls from her and her husband in the past, so I recognized her voice. I dispatched an ambulance to her residence and held her on the line, trying to keep her calm while the ambulance was on their way. They advised that they had a 15-minute ETA since she lived in a very rural part of West Virginia. I was talking to her and asking about how her husband was doing, just to make small talk to comfort her. The ambulance called in to let me know they were on the scene, and I let them know she was in severe respiratory distress and that I still had her on the line. I told the woman that the responders were coming to the door and that she should go answer it right away. She agreed and hung up the phone. Pretty normal, yeah? Well, here's where it gets weird. The EMT and paramedic on scene called back about a minute later and told me that no one was answering the door. We have a sheriff unit who was in the area pulling on scene about that time. The sheriff unit confirmed the address and advised he was breaching the door to get to the caller. 5 minutes went by, and the paramedic on scene radioed in asking who the caller was. I told him it was the elderly female who lived at the residence. He sounded confused and told me he was going to call in and needed to speak with the supervisor on shift. I got him over to the supervisor, who confirmed the information I gave him and asked what was going on. Apparently, the elderly woman had been dead for a while and was already in full rigor mortis. They thought I was wrong on the caller, but the other dispatchers played it back and confirmed that it was her who called. My dad told me this story when I was 12. Even now, when I ask him about it, he can remember every vivid detail, like it just happened last week. My dad was in the police force for over 20 years in Asia, and when he was just a rookie, he had to conduct nighttime roadblocks meant to catch drunk drivers. They had done it many times before, and this night started out routine enough for them. That was until this Toyota Corolla drove up to them with what looked like a white blanket on its roof, flapping in the wind. They thought it was weird, but didn't see anything amiss about it. One of them even joked that this guy was multitasking by drying his laundry and driving home at the same time. The laugh stopped when the lone car came closer, and they saw what looked like a woman in white lying face down on top of the car. The woman seemed to slide like a slug backwards until she disappeared behind the car as it eventually came to a stop in front of them. It took a few minutes for my dad's team to recompose themselves as they stared at each other, trying to figure out what they had just saw. The most senior officer there finally stepped up and asked the usual questions to the driver. There was a noticeable quiver in his voice as he made conversation and asked him to step out of the vehicle. My dad's team inspected the whole vehicle, including the trunk, and found nothing strange in it. The driver was a good-looking staff surgeon in the Army who was heading home from a company event earlier that night and admitted to having a few beers. He said that he had laid down in his bunk to sleep it off, hence why he was driving home around 4 a.m. He passed their sobriety tests, and they started to ask him if he saw anything weird during his drive. Initially, he said no, but after more questioning, he mentioned that he had to swerve to avoid what looked like a bird that was flying upside down. It was spooky, but he didn't think it was a detail worth sharing with the police. The senior officer then told the guy to hang out at the 24-hour coffee shop nearby before heading home. I guess the locals believe that if a malevolent spirit follows you, making a pit stop confuses them so that they can't find their way into your house. After some confusion of his own, the driver finally caught on to what the officer was insinuating and nodded in agreement. After he left, they called into the station and cut the night short. I was a patrol officer in a large West Coast city for a short period a little while back. The city I worked for had, and continues to have, a problematic influx of transients. The first thing you learn when dealing with homeless population is that mental health problems and drug use are overwhelmingly abundant. By the end of my stint, I felt more like an armed social worker than a police officer, and that's one of the reasons I left. I've always been a horror movie buff. After The Conjuring debuted, I bought a copy of The Demonologist, the biography of Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ed recounts meeting a homeless man in New York City who spoke as if he was possessed, and went on to say that prolonged cases of mental anguish can lead to influence from otherworldly beings. I'm not sure if I believe that or not, but I always kept it in the back of my mind. I do know certain chemical substances like DMT and MDMA can make the user see or feel the presence of spiritual entities. So many homeless people have drug addiction problems that I wouldn't be surprised that if these entities are real, they wouldn't find ways to mess with these people. One night, on a patrol in a 2-man car, I was flagged down by a disheveled man standing next to a Winnebago. He told me a woman he didn't know was inside with his son and wouldn't leave. After alerting dispatch, my partner and I knocked on the door and asked if we could come in. The son said yes, and I stepped inside. The woman looked slightly less disheveled than the son, but I could tell she was either on something or mentally ill. The son was lying very still on a cot, looking absolutely terrified. The woman was quietly mumbling something and fidgeting with empty hands. After trying and failing to converse with her, she quickly ran out of the Winnebago. Neither the complainant or the son wanted to file a report and simply asked us to keep an eye on the area. I agreed, walked back to my car, and slowly drove away. About a block down the road, I saw the woman walking slowly and decided to pull up and try to talk to her again. We pulled up and my partner rolled down his window and asked for her name. She said it was Rachel and began to mumble louder and faster. The fidgeting intensified, and the only intelligible thing we could hear her say was that she was always searching. My partner calmly and patiently asked her the basic questions. Where do you live? Do you know how to get home? Are you hurt or in danger? Etc., but wasn't getting anywhere. At this point, I started to feel a little creeped out, but hadn't said anything. Something in her eyes told me this was all wrong. Rachel continued to mumble and fidget, but was looking down at her hands the whole time. Thinking back to what I had read in The Demonologist, I decided to run a little experiment, knowing that I might not get the chance to do so again. I began mouthing the Lord's Prayer in Old English, not actually saying anything, just thinking it and moving my lips. I continued staring at Rachel to make sure she wasn't looking at me to see what I was doing. As soon as I finished the last line, Rachel stopped mumbling. She jerked her head up, eyes wide, and glared at me for the longest moment I've ever felt before sprinting down the street to an alley. I don't know if that was necessarily anything supernatural, but it sure as hell creeped me out for the next few days.